It finds that coercive interrogation techniques
On Diplomatic Channel this week, the recently released CIA torture report in the United States generates reaction from all over the world, and fresh crisis brews in the Middle East after the death of a Palestinian minister in the West Bank. Finally, a fresh look at Syria's civil war and the activities of the Islamic State militants. Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Temitope Fagbemi. A U.S. Senate report says a program of enhanced interrogation used by the CIA on terrorism suspects after the September 2001 attacks was far more brutal than the agency admitted. The report also said the CIA misled the public and policymakers about the program, much of which was developed, operated, and assessed by two outside contractors.
After 5 years of research, a CIA secret is out in the open. A new Senate Intelligence Committee report says the CIA's harsh interrogation program for terrorism suspects and its methods were far more brutal than the agency acknowledged.
The report released today examines the CIA's secret overseas detention of at least 119 individuals and the use of coercive interrogation techniques, in some cases amounting to torture.
The program began after the 9/11 attacks, in which more than 3,000 people were killed. Then President George W. Bush authorized the program as a hunt for Al-Qaeda leaders began. The report says the program led to a series of secret CIA prisons, including some suspected detention centers in Afghanistan, Poland, and Romania. It was in these prisons that the report says suspects were deprived of sleep, kept in isolation, and chained to concrete floors while partially nude. The CIA has dismissed the findings, saying the interrogations did result in valuable information.
I have already stated that our reviews indicate that the detention and interrogation program produced useful intelligence that helped the United States thwart attack plans, capture terrorists, and save lives.
But the report says otherwise.
It finds that coercive interrogation techniques did not produce the vital, otherwise unavailable intelligence the CIA has claimed.
In a television interview, President Barack Obama, who banned harsh interrogation techniques after taking office in 2009, said the CIA tactics were brutal.
Some of the tactics that were written about in the Senate Intelligence Report were brutal. It constituted torture in my mind, and that's not who we are. And so, although I am concerned about potential ramifications overseas, and we've taken precautionary steps to try to mitigate any additional risks, I think it was important for us to release this so that we can account for it, so that people understand precisely why I banned these practices as one of the first acts I took when I came into office, and hopefully make sure that we don't make those mistakes again.
British Prime Minister David Cameron also said torture is wrong and makes no contribution to the fight against terrorism.
Torture is wrong. Torture is always wrong. Those of us who want to see a safer, more secure world, who want to see this extremism defeated, we won't succeed if we lose our moral authority.
Meanwhile, a former Guantanamo Bay detainee says the use of torture led indirectly to the rise in Islamic State militants.
ISIS was born in the dungeons of Abu Ghraib. It was born in the dungeons of the Iraqi prisons that were under US occupation, and that's where this hatred and animosity has festered. So what we found now, we're in a situation that's worse than the beginning of the war on terror. And when torture was used, when Dick Cheney said we have to operate in the dark side, what he didn't say was what was going to be the consequence of that torture.
Many US Republicans have condemned the report, saying its release would put Americans at risk.
Meanwhile, the United Nations and other human rights groups are calling for the prosecution of U.S. officials involved in the brutal CIA interrogation of Al-Qaeda suspects.
Obviously, the follow-up debate, I think, will be about accountability, about, whether or not people can be charged for not just people who carried out the torture, but people who order it, people who devise the policy of it, etc.
It's illegal under international law for anyone to follow a blatantly illegal order. But really the ones to blame in this case are the senior U.S. officials that authorized the abuse, knowing that it was illegal. They're the ones at the top that need to be held accountable for these crimes.
But my colleague at the Voice of America, Jeff Seldin, says prosecution is unlikely.
The Justice Department here in the United States did 2 criminal investigations and looked at a lot of the evidence that was presented in the Senate report, or similar evidence, back in 2009, and ultimately decided not to pursue any criminal prosecutions. The Department of Justice, its attorneys found there were no grounds that the measures that were used had been approved by both the White House and by personnel within the Justice Department and fell within the scope of legality. There was no ability to prosecute. As for whether there's international grounds for prosecution, that's a bit more interesting. The UN Special Rapporteur has called for a criminal prosecution, citing the UN Convention on Torture, other UN conventions saying that the U.S. is legally obligated to do this. But so far, there's been no indication from the Justice Department that any prosecution will take place.
Now, there's so much hue and cry over the CIA's use of torture after the 9/11 attacks, but we need to find out how the Nigeria police obtains information from alleged criminals. Do they also make use of torture? To answer this question, I spoke to a human rights lawyer via telephone, Mr. Femi Falana, and this is what he had to say.
Well, every country has to take on, why there is so much hue and cry over the U.S. is because of the level of hypocrisy displayed by the United States government when it comes to human rights. In fact, on an annual basis, on a yearly basis, the United States government compiles reports on human rights violations around the world, except the U.S., of course, giving the impression that the United States government is the bastion of democracy and human rights. That's why there is so much hue and cry. In the case of Nigeria, we talk about it from time to time. We speak against torture, but I think we are going to appeal to the media to help us and humanize detention centers in our country, to pay more attention, pay less attention to politicians and conventions, and pay some attention to Nigerians that are discriminated, being harassed, intimidated, and being subjected to dehumanizing, subhuman conditions in police detention centers.
But in Nigeria here, what is the way forward? How can we abolish torture in our Nigerian prisons?
All victims, the way forward is for all victims of torture, once they're out of detention, either of the police or other agents, to go to court and ask for damage, so that if there is sufficient attention, the government will be forced to respect the rights of Nigerians and, eliminate torture. Because our country has signed the instrument against torture, the UN Convention against torture.
Coming up after the break, what killed Palestinian minister Ziad Abu Ain? Was it a heart attack or was he murdered by Israeli security forces? More on that story in a moment.